Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane, and it's the morning of Wednesday, 25th of April 2018, and as you can see, it's a wet and well, miserable, not really I suppose, but it's wet here in East Lancashire on the banks of the Liverpool-Leeds Canal. Now this morning's live stream is titled Fracking and Health, an oxymoron in the extreme. And really this is a case of looking at what is occurring and going beyond one-dimensional thinking, which of course is what the media wants to keep people locked into, that there's no relationship whatsoever between any of the major issues impacting upon people's lives in the country, around the country. But in reality, of course, they do. And it's increasingly important that people actually start to join the dots. Now, obviously, the news over the last few days has been taken up in the UK by the most unusual events. It's an event that only occurs about, on average, apparently 4.3 times every single second around the planet. And that is somebody, or a soul re-entering or entering this mortal coil. But on this occasion, of course, it's somebody who is born into a family that are effectively supported by the 50+ million people who happen to reside in this country. So once everybody gets over the uniqueness of this event, then maybe we can get back down to the real issues. But of course, it's a distraction. Let's keep people away from the real issues which impact on their lives. And the issue that I really want to address this morning is really brought about by the headlines across various papers that the NHS chief, which is a guy by the name of Simon Stevens, the NHS chief has said tax homes of elderly to fund growing social care bill. Well, of course, you know, for the number of years now, many people around the country have been expressing concern about the speed with which the National Health Service is being dismantled. And of course, there's no question that when people do get treated within the National Health, the vast majority of them do get extremely good health care. The issue is actually getting there in the first place, because as waiting times increase in emergency rooms up and down the country, and waiting lists for routine operations get increasingly longer and longer. And of course, there's absolutely no question that many people actually move on from this mortal coil before receiving the treatment that they are actually entitled to, but is not available to them because of a lack of resources, whether that's medical staff or simply the funding. Yet Simon Stevens, who draws a salary of in excess of £190,000 a year, and of course has a very, very attractive pension plan to go with that, he has the audacity to say that the homes of elderly should be effectively used to pay for social care. Well, I'm not sure where this guy's been for the last 2 decades, but that's been going on up and down the country for the last at least 2 decades, where local authorities demand that properties are effectively signed over to them so that the properties can then be sold to pay for particularly retirement care. Well, what these people are left with, having worked all their lives to pay off the mortgage, the death grip, to pay off the mortgage and have what they think is an asset that they can then pass on to their descendants, well, the local authorities effectively take that property and allow them to keep just £16,000. Now, I'm going to share with you, there is an absolute legitimate way to make sure that your property can never be used to fund costs that are effectively an entitlement because of national insurance and other benefits that have been paid across the course of a working life, and that is to put your property into trust. This is simply using the same techniques that the parasites who think that they are the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom, it's what they use. It's why when the Duke of Westminster died, what is it, a couple of years ago now, but he left a legacy of some £9 billion. And yet there were no death duties payable on that because it was all in trust. So, of course, do your own research. I'm not a financial advisor, so do your own research and take a look, or go speak to a legal advisor or financial advisor and look at how you can put your property into trust. It's not cheap. It will cost a few £1,000s, and you do have to survive for 7 years before the trust effectively becomes live. But once that property is in trust, it is untouchable, and the trust can then be set up for the benefit of your descendants. So if just one person actually takes a look at that process and decides that yes, this is something that is viable, it is workable, it puts the property in a secure ring fence, which means the state can't touch it, then it's worthwhile doing. But anyway, let's have a look at Simon Stevens, the man who says that basically properties shouldn't just be used for funding retirement care, they should be used for the benefit of funding the NHS and for people who need increasing amounts of treatment in later life. Well, and of course, actually, he's focusing on the wrong area. The people who should be paying for that are Big Pharma, because hospitals are little more these days than front of house for the pharmaceutical companies. So on the basis that it's the pharmaceutical companies that are making outrageous profits on the back of the poor health, much of which is often brought about by the use of pharmaceuticals. But then surely, these are the corporations that should be being taxed, and that money should be used for funding the healthcare. But hey, you're not likely to hear that from any politician, because Big Pharma will of course be lobbying and throwing the goodies at them, throwing the foreign trips abroad, throwing the foreign conferences, which are little more than golfing holidays, to keep their tame politicians sweet. Anyway, Simon Stevens. Well, prior to taking on the role as head of the NHS, he was actually senior executive at a United States company called United Healthcare, which actually was subjected to a lawsuit in the US because it was accused of manipulating data to underpay doctors, which in the US is another oxymoron. I've never seen a poor doctor or a dentist in the US, that's for sure. But here's what one journalist wrote about Simon Stevens. If any company needed a manager who can aggressively cut costs while claiming to improve services, Simon Stevens is your man. Now, this guy was formerly a Blairite and actually sat as a Labour councillor on Brixton Borough Council, back in the turn of the century, between 98 and 2002. So this supposed Labour boy, let's have a look at the background. Well, he's from Birmingham originally, but studied at Balliol College in Oxford, and is reportedly a close associate with Boris Johnson, of course, who is a very, very dangerous buffoon. And as we've seen over the past few weeks, Boris Johnson is, how shall I say, has a very casual relationship with truth, has a very casual relationship with facts, and certainly would not in any way, shape or form be really, truly entitled to the tag of a statesman. He is a man-child, masquerading as Foreign Secretary. But let's take a look at how this is linked in, because Simon Stevens is also supposedly the brains behind the sugar tax in the UK, and looking at imposing a tax on food and drinks in particular that pump out high doses of sugar thereby increasing risks of obesity or diabetes. So what effect is that happening? Well, recently I went to visit a good friend in York Hospital, and every one of the drinks vending machines in the corridors around the hospital proudly displays this label that says no sugar. And yet, what is in those drinks? They are loaded with artificial sweeteners, and in particular, aspartame. And let's take a look at the background of aspartame, because aspartame was actually labelled as a poison up until 1983. And in fact, the company that had developed this, or stumbled across the fact that this toxin was also very sweet when added to foods and drink, was a company called Searle. And who was head of Searle at the time? Well, it was none other than Donald Rumsfeld. And Donald Rumsfeld, as chief executive of Searle, approached Ronald Reagan when he was in the run-up to his presidential campaign, and he basically told Reagan, he said, look, if you become president, and I will do everything I can to support you in your campaign to become president, then I will need a favour in return. And Reagan said, well, of course. So, well, what would that be? And he said, well, what I need is I need the head of the Food and Drug Administration replaced, because the guy that's in situ right now will not approve this product, aspartame, for use in food. Anyway, Reagan becomes president, and within hours of being sworn in as president in '83, then Rumsfeld reminded him of his commitment, and just a few months later, the head of the FDA was replaced, and in May of 1983, aspartame was licensed for use in food and beverage products. So now, with not even 40 years experience, or 35 years experience now, of aspartame, please do your own research and take a look at the studies of the effects of aspartame, and let me tell you that it's not all positive. In fact, I would much rather have sugar in something than I would aspartame. So artificial sweeteners, definitely not what they're cracked up to be. In fact, I prefer not to use sugar, so I tend to use honey, which I know some people are going to argue is just sugar in another form. But hey, one has to strike a balance somewhere. So the negative impacts of artificial sweeteners also have an impact on healthcare. And meanwhile, of course, the healthcare services in the UK are effectively being dismantled. Well, it's the same with fracking. And right now we've got public inquiries going on in not too far from here in West Lancashire, in Blackpool, as an inquiry looks at the quadrilla application to establish a well site at Rosica. And then in Derbyshire we have the public inquiry, the start of the public inquiry, where INEOS want to effectively force their way into Derbyshire to initiate the process that would ultimately lead to the exploitation of unconventional gas. And what we do know now, after barely 2 decades of experience of unconventional gas exploitation in the US, in Canada, in Australia, is that for those who have the misfortune to live in the sacrifice zones, the negative impact on health is horrendous. And in Australia, when people who have the misfortune to live in the gas fields have to go to hospital, they're taken to Brisbane, and the impact is not linked to the fact that they live in a gas field. So, the statistics, as is always the case, are manipulated to hide the real impact, the real cause of the negative health impact. And as we know, it is always the vulnerable, the elderly, those who already have underlying health conditions, or of course the unborn or the newly born, that are the first to suffer. But then you get the likes of Simon Stevens comes along, who says, well, that's okay, we'll just tax your property. It is truly time for people to do their own research. And we've got the double assault now, not just of unconventional gas exploitation in the UK, which the anti-fracking community has managed to kick the can down the road now for, what is it, 5+ plus years since the moratorium was lifted in December 2012. And the reality is that as time goes on, the likelihood of the unconventional gas industry becoming established in the UK becomes increasingly more remote. But there is a greater threat looming, and this is the rollout of 5G. And actually, somebody asked me the question the other day, and they said, Ian, do you think that fracking has simply been a distraction? And I had to say, there is indeed the distinct possibility that those who have the capacity to literally game social engineering, to look at how the wider communities can be managed and how the interests of the corporatocracy can be best served by using the old magician's trick of take a look over here whilst actually the real stuff is going on with the other hand behind your back. And there is that possibility. And if nothing else, then fracking is certainly being used as the magician's trick to hide the research into the use of deep boreholes for the disposal of toxic nuclear waste. Now, this is a subject that I and others have been talking about now for 4 years, and yet the British government and radioactive waste management and the nuclear industry refuse to dismiss. I mean, how tough would it be to say, no, that is absolutely not the case? Well, they find it a little bit difficult to do that, of course, when they've got Professor Fergus Gibb on the payroll at Sheffield University, who is at the forefront of developing the technology for deep borehole disposal of toxic nuclear waste. And how coincident is it that Sheffield is also very much on point with the destruction of their tree population, some 17,500 trees being destroyed by Amy, and of course it's a contract that Sheffield County Council have refused to make public, and in response to freedom of information requests submitted by the Yorkshire Post, they refused to disclose the detail of the contract with Amy. And of course, the reason that they put a pause on the destruction of the trees right now is because of the increasing awareness that the destruction of the trees was directly linked to the planned rollout of 5G in 2020. And with the pause in place, what Sheffield County Council and Amy and Telefonica and all the other companies, O2 of course, that's Telefonica in the UK, what they're hoping is that this will all die down. And maybe they can come up with a plan which isn't quite so aggressive, and they can start taking the trees down without anyone noticing. Well, of course, what is happening is people all around the country are noticing that the trees are being culled, and it's not just in this country. Because, believe it or not, there's actually 1 or 2 people in Australia who watch these live streams, and they have identified that some of the tree-lined cities in Australia are also suffering the Sheffield effect. And in fact, I should be doing an interview on Sunday evening with a radio station in South Australia, where the residents of Adelaide are starting to become increasingly concerned about the destruction of trees in their city and the rollout of 5G. Now, Sheffield goes to the polls next Thursday. Thursday the 3rd, not tomorrow, next Thursday, Thursday the 3rd of May. And Sheffield is one of those locations that has the opportunity to elect a city mayor. So here's the questions that people of Sheffield need to be putting to the mayor. Number one, of course, is, as mayor, will you release the full detail of the contract between Sheffield Council and Amy? And if it is ultimately proven beyond any reasonable doubt that there is a direct relationship between the removal and the culling of these trees in Sheffield and the rollout of 5G, will you go on public record and make that statement? Well, that will put the fear of God into the establishment, because as with the deep borehole disposal of toxic nuclear waste, as with the impacts of fracking, it's like, let's play all this down until it's far too late for people to actually do anything about it. And of course, the impact on healthcare is surely self-evident. So as we roll out these pernicious technologies, these unproven technologies, well, the only thing that is proven is that they are not in the best interests of human or any other organic health. And at the very least, the precautionary principle should be being applied. And that is that nothing is rolled out until such time as it is established beyond any reasonable doubt that the risks are effectively negligent to, well, non-existent basically, and that the impact on the people who have the misfortune to live on the sacrifice zone is absolutely benign. Sadly, that is not the case, and we have far too many politicians who are rather too quick to take the corporate bung, whether it's as a directorship. I mean, look at those people who sit on multiple boards. Their contribution, their meaningful contribution to those boards in which they sit has to be considered to be negligible. They may throw in the odd piece of wisdom, but when you look at how much they are being paid for that occasional piece of wisdom, it's obscene. They're not being paid for their wisdom. They are being paid to push through the corporatist agenda so that those who stand to gain from the increase in stock price or the increase in profits can laugh all the way to the bank and go into hysterics as they move it from a UK bank into their offshore account. Meanwhile, let's start to play them at least at their own game. And if you do have a property, if you have an asset that you own outright, that you have no mortgage, no death grip on it any longer, then seriously consider doing your own research to look at the benefit of putting that property into trust and keep it for your family rather than to a corporatist government that wants to use it to fund a healthcare system that's failing due to their corporatist agenda. Thanks for joining me today. I shall be back tomorrow morning. I shall be back in the southwest, and tomorrow evening I will be broadcasting an episode of Humanity versus Insanity, and my guest will be Dilyana Gatansheva, the Bulgarian journalist that has blown the whistle on the illegal shipment of US, UK and Israeli armaments to ISIS, and more recently has exposed the web of biological laboratories in the old Soviet satellite countries of Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, etc. And of course, Dilyana is also going to be a speaker at the forthcoming AV9 conference the weekend after next. So either join me tomorrow morning at 8:30 or tomorrow evening at 7:30 on ukcolumn.org, ukcolumn.org/live for my interview with Dilyana Gatansheva. Thanks a lot. You have a great day, and I'll catch you with you tomorrow. What do you know? Facebook doesn't want me to sign off.